All right, welcome everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar titled Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment in Atlanta. My name is Kyle James and I'm the Development and Outreach Coordinator at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. For those of you not familiar with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, we are a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible energy choices that work to address the impacts of global climate change and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. So today I want to talk to you guys real shortly about the text slides. So to ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout the presentation. Go ahead and find the 3 buttons along the top of your control panel. If you're having trouble hearing or seeing the slides, click the blue chat button and type in your problem so that I can help you troubleshoot. We have also saved time at the end of this presentation to answer any questions about today's topic. To ask a question, click the question mark button along the top of your screen. Make sure all panelists is showing up in the drop-down menu. Then type your question into the questions text box. We will do our best to answer questions in the order that we receive them. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our program manager, Ann Blair, the Director for Clean Fuels for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Ann?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kyle. We are pleased to have you all on today's webinar, Atlanta's EVSE webinar, otherwise known as Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment, or EV charging stations. As Kyle mentioned, I'm the Director of Clean Fuels at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Through our Clean Fuels program, we're working to cut projected U.S. oil use and transportation emissions through widespread deployment of cars that run on electricity. Transportation is now the #1 source of CO2 emissions, and our use of oil jeopardizes national security. Electrification stands to benefit individual drivers and fleet managers who will save on fuel costs, communities in need of cleaner air, as well as provide grid benefits in the future. Our cities and states can and are leading the way in supporting technology development and deployment. We're pleased to work with many partners, including the City of Atlanta and the Electrification Coalition, who are presenting today. So let's get started. The first speaker today is Ryan Daly. Ryan is with the Electrification Coalition, a nonpartisan, not-for-profit group of business leaders committed to promoting policies and actions that facilitate the deployment of electric vehicles on a mass scale. Ryan has been working on the deployment of alternative fuel and advanced vehicle technologies for more than 8 years, with stints in both the public and private sector. In his role with the Electrification Coalition, he focused primarily on analytic and technical assistance to fleets as they implement electric vehicle programs. Our second speaker will be Justin Breithart. He is a native of Atlanta, graduating from Georgia State University in August of 2016 with a degree in environmental geosciences. He is currently the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Fellow for the Atlanta Mayor's Office of Resilience and the Electrification Coalition. So Ryan, please begin.
Okay, there, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Ann, for the introduction, and we'll go ahead and go on to the next set of slides. First of all, I'll just give a quick overview of the agenda we want to go through today. I will do a brief introduction of the Electrification Coalition, our background, our memorandum of understanding with the City of Atlanta, as well as some of our national programs and the work that we're doing around the rest of the country. And then I will turn things over to Justin Breithart, who will then dig into the specifics about both the electric vehicle and EVSE efforts in Atlanta, Georgia. So going forward, and to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as mentioned, the Electrification Coalition is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit group of business leaders who are committed to promoting policies and actions that facilitate the deployment of electric vehicles on a mass scale. And as an organization, our interest is specifically in promoting the economic and national security benefits of this transition to electric vehicles in order to reduce our dependence on oil as a transportation fuel. As part of that, we entered into a partnership with the City of Atlanta in the summer of 2016, where we had created a technical advisor position that would help the city manage their electric vehicle program, promote that program to other entities and then assist Atlanta with implementing best practices for their own electric vehicle program. Within this, our goals are to secure strategic partnerships with the vehicle manufacturers and support EV initiatives within Atlanta and elsewhere, to identify barriers that the city had with their own experiences transitioning to electric vehicles, and then use those barriers and lessons learned to develop communication tools that can be shared throughout the network of cities, manufacturers, infrastructure developers, et cetera. And so that is the reason that we all find ourselves here today, learning about the lessons learned from Atlanta's experience installing charging infrastructure to support their vehicles. Quickly, I want to go over some of our national programs so that you all have a little bit of context as to who we are and the work that we are doing elsewhere. So one of the main efforts of the Electrification Coalition, really how the organization got its feet wet in electric vehicle deployments, is in EV Accelerator Communities. And the first one of these was in northern Colorado, centered around Fort Collins, where we worked with that city, dealership networks in the area, as well as various other stakeholders to speed the deployment of electric vehicles in the region. And this had to do with a various different efforts in the area that included group buys, educational workshops, working with the city to develop local policies and incentives, also working with transportation network companies and taxis to deploy electric vehicles into public fleets, working with dealers in particular to increase their inventory and availability of electric vehicles, as well as leadership programs where we engage with local business and political leaders to showcase EVs so that they get a hands-on experience with the technology, as well as extended ride and drives and workplace charging. We're continuing these efforts in Orlando, where we have Drive Electric Orlando, an effort that focuses on renting electric vehicles to visitors, as it is the largest tourist destination in the United States. This way we can get the public's hands-on electric vehicles for extended ride and drives. And we're also developing a new community in Rochester, New York, which is just getting underway this summer. We also have the Energy Secure Cities Coalition, of which Atlanta is one of the founding members. The goal of this effort is to unite 25 cities to retire 50,000 petroleum vehicles and save over 500,000 barrels of oil every year. From our perspective, mayors and cities are really the catalyst in a national EV transition, and they can demonstrate the effectiveness of these vehicles in their fleets at the local level and really drive market adoption when there may be less action at state and federal levels. The current cities that are members of this coalition include Indianapolis, Atlanta, Sacramento, San Diego, Oakland, Charlotte, West Palm Beach, and Rochester. And should any of our attendees today have an interest in additional information about this program or in potentially joining, please feel free to contact me afterwards. Real quickly, a couple of other programs that we are involved with that you all may be aware of. The first is the Smart Cities Challenge. This was is a grant that was co-funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation and Vulcan. There were 7 finalists out of 78 original applicants last year. The 7 finalists included Denver, Austin, San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Kansas City, and Portland, Oregon. As you all may know, Columbus eventually won this grant, and we continue to be involved with them on a daily basis as they work to implement the programs that are being funded. In particular, right now we have helped them with their transition of 200 vehicles within the municipal fleet by assisting with an electric vehicle suitability analysis and providing technical assistance on their procurement. In addition to this, we have begun working on a project called the Coalition of 7, which represents the 7 finalists that we just mentioned. Since all of them had a variety of wonderful ideas that were innovative, new, and in the spirit of the Smart City agenda overall. So we've kept this group together and created a formal group that will demonstrate the effective strategies for new mobility as these cities implement the things that they pitched in their applications, even without the funding from Department of Transportation and Vulcan. And so through that, we will be looking for ways to accelerate the adoption of EVs, create autonomous vehicle demonstrations, and demonstrate other innovations in shared mobility and on-demand transportation. Lastly, the Electrification Coalition is a technical coordinator for electric vehicles on Fleets for the Future, which is an aggregated purchasing effort funded by the U.S. Department of Energy, whereby we are looking to aggregate the demand for EVs across municipalities, cities, counties, states, and other public sector entities so that we can bring down the cost, the upfront acquisition cost of electric vehicles. We are in the process of developing a national pilot procurement for this effort, which we will be presenting at the ACT Expo next month. So if any of you are attending there, we'll go into much greater detail with that effort. Again, if there are any interested parties, please follow up with us afterwards. And with that, I just want to leave you with a quick snapshot of some of the benefits of electric vehicles in fleets. As many of you are probably aware, electric vehicles can be much less expensive, to own and operate than their traditional petroleum counterparts. Of course, this comes with the difficulty of a higher upfront acquisition cost, but as those acquisition costs come down, the operating costs become a much better economic benefit. Many municipal fleets also have route predictability, high utilization rates, and the use of central parking facilities, all of which can help not only with the implementation of the vehicles, but also with the placement of charging infrastructure. Electricity is also much lower in terms of fuel prices, which makes operating the vehicles much less expensive, and when put into the correct application, the upfront acquisition cost investments can realize a return on that over the life cycle of a vehicle. And of course, EVs also contribute to the sustainability initiatives that fleets may have around reducing greenhouse gas emissions and or petroleum consumption. And so with that, I will turn things over to Justin, and we will learn more about what is happening in Atlanta.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Ann and Kyle, for the introduction and hosting, and thank you for everybody for attending. So Atlanta has a fleet replacement program, and this was a contract formed in December of 2015 with a third-party financier. It was a pilot program where we were able to lease electric vehicles and electric vehicle supply equipment, but for the rest of this presentation, we'll be just referring to it as charging stations. And bulk purchases, and this helped us launch the EV program a lot quicker. And this was just a one-time procurement process. And with that program, we were able to get 60 plug-in electric vehicles. That's 35 Chevy Volts and 25 Nissan Leafs with telematics devices from Fleet Karma for data collection. And I'll explain more about what those telematics devices do later in the presentation. And so far with this program, on top with the 60 PEVs, we also have 23 charging stations for our EVs. And that is a 2.9, that's a ratio for 2.9 vehicles to each charging station. And we did want to have more vehicles than charging stations to make sure we're getting the utilization out of these vehicles. And just below that, you'll see some estimates about what we're expecting in the next year from these 60 vehicles in terms of meeting our CO2 emissions goals, reducing gallons of gasoline, and also just overall savings. And if you go to the next slide. So with that program, it has been a relative success. Our employees have shown given back positive feedback from it. It's helped reach our goals, but how we got started was, as Ryan mentioned earlier, was the Energy Secure Cities Coalition. And so by being a part of that, it became from Mayor Kasim Reed, his sustainability goals, which were Atlanta will be a top-tier city for sustainability. And as a part of that, Atlanta will also deploy one of the nation's largest municipal fleets of EVs. So with that goal in mind, we started that program, and now we're looking to expand the amount of EVs that are currently within the fleet. And we've made a commitment to the White House last October, where we would convert 20% of our municipal fleet to electric vehicles by 2020, as well as adding more public charging stations at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. And on top of that, we've also joined an EV RFI with 29 other North American cities. And so with those, and with that going into adding all these different vehicles, we want to make sure that we have a robust infrastructure to support them. And so if you go on to the next slide, this is more about our experience with adding charging stations. So we did develop a document with the Electrification Coalition that gives them a very detailed experience on just some different case studies and what we've experienced in installing charging stations. We'd be more than happy to send that out after this presentation, but we'll hit on some of the key highlights within that document and the rest of the presentation. So when installing charging stations, there is a process and cost involved. So when we were adding our charging stations, we were considering location, the number of charging stations, the power level, so that meaning level 1, level 2, or DC fast chargers. If this is going to be for private use, which is for only our city vehicles, or it would also be open to the public as well as city vehicles. So, and that was more with our workplace charging. Driver outreach and engagement, and data collection and analysis. And so just to give an example, we did have a ride and drive with our city employees just as we were getting these vehicles in so they could get a little more used to the vehicles. And that was with Nissan, GM, Tesla, and Kia. And so by them driving around, they could get used to them, and with that, they also were interested in buying their own personal EV. So that is something that we're also considering when adding these charging stations. Would these just be open to the city vehicles, or would they also be open to employees so they can charge their own electric vehicle while at work? And also another portion of that fleet replacement agreement that we mentioned earlier, we have a standard max of $3,000 per non-networked charging station. And we'll talk about non-networked versus network stations in just a second. But that $3,000 covers the hardware, the installation, any, say, unexpected costs, say, for cutting through concrete. And we've seen so far it's roughly a little over $2,000, but that $3,000 gives us some wiggle room to add these as we start adding these charging stations strategically throughout the city. And if you please go to the next slide. So private charging stations and data. So you have network stations and not-network stations. Network stations are connected to a network, and that's usually where you can get a very good amount of data, very quality data as well. They will have a fee structure, although that's not usually required, and that just changed the ownership of the stations. And we did see that was a better application for public use, because for the city of Atlanta, we do have a couple of public charging stations on either side of City Hall that are for on-street parking, and those do require a payment to utilize, but it's been utilized fairly well so far. And then with non-network stations that is not connected to any network, will not have a fee structure, and we found this was a better application for our own municipal fleet. And so that's where we have those 23 charging stations, 10 within our City Hall parking garage that is utilized by about 6 or 7 departments. Then we have, then we also have 10 at our public safety headquarters, which is utilized by our police department, our fire department, and our corrections. And then we have 3 that are with the Department of Watershed and our Employee Psychological Services. And so, we're trying to strategically place them where as many departments can utilize them, and those 60 PUVs have been dispersed throughout those departments mentioned, as well as our Department of Public Works too. And they're usually utilized for administrative purposes as well as community outreach and engagement. And so our data collection, since we did go with the non-network station, which is not connected to any network, so we're not getting any data from them, we used those telematics devices. That's a part of that fleet replacement agreement. And those telematics devices collect the electric miles versus the gas miles. It's very critical for us, especially when utilizing the Chevy Volts. And in collecting this data, it helps us to make sure that we're analyzing our cost savings and the emissions, that the goals that we've set, to make sure that we are getting that payback with the vehicles. And we can also manage driver behavior by utilizing this. So if we see that the more so for the Volts, for example, if we're utilizing more Chevy, more of the gas side, we can try to figure out a way to do some education or some outreach to say, well, let's try to figure out a way to use more electric miles. That could be trying to reduce that range anxiety, also trying to figure out to see where we can put more charging stations. And also we do have a goal with these different vehicles. So with the Chevy Volts, we have a yearly goal of driving 10,500 miles, and then with electric miles. And then with the Nissan Leaf, we have 7,500 miles. And that's that mark that we use to make sure that we are getting that payback. And that's where these telematics devices become very important for us. And if you go on to the next slide, please. Developing the infrastructure for these charging stations. So we based this off of how we figured out where to put the charging stations. We looked at the departments that have a large amount of vehicles within the within a certain area. So in that we looked at daily work schedules and routines, and we're currently working with our IT department since they have 5 Nissan Leafs to further expand that network as they go out to visits, not just within City Hall, but within our other city buildings, so they can charge while they're doing their work. We mainly have level 2 charging stations. We found that to be the most cost effective and the most used by drivers. So since we want these vehicles going in and out, since we do have that 2.9-to-1 ratio for vehicles to stations. So as drivers are going out and doing the work for the city, other people can come in and charge, and then they can leave and go do other work that they need to do. And also, just as a side note, charging stations are similar to interstates, whereas the amps are the number of lanes, the volts is the speed limit, and then the electrons or the power are cars. So in a sense, you're building an interstate of power to your electric vehicles. So you want to make sure you're developing an infrastructure within infrastructure. And with that, I believe we'll go into our different case studies to show what it was like installing these charging stations and developing this infrastructure and what we've learned along the way. And our first case study is 818 Pollard. This is where our Atlanta Workforce Development Agency is headquartered. This was a preferred location for electric vehicles. The site was expected to get 2 Nissan Leafs and 2 charging stations. And that's 2 charging spaces, 1 dual port charging station. And we were interested in this location because the city of Atlanta does have an equity goal. And with the population that this area targets, we thought this would be a good way of increasing more public EV adoption as well. And then, so if you look at the different colored ovals, these were the sites that we were looking at to adding the charging stations. So on the top of the picture, you'll see a red oval, and that is where we were looking at adding charging stations, but that was the least desired spot due to the lack of security cameras and security personnel. And there was also a lot of high foot traffic. And with that, we nixed that particular location. And so we were looking at the yellow oval, which is down closer to the bottom. And that's where that was the preferred location for the Atlanta Workforce Development, because it was in front of the security team. It was right in front of the door, and it was also It also had security cameras. Excuse me. However, that would have disrupted daily operations because you would have to cut through the concrete as well as the asphalt. And that road, which is right next to that yellow oval, is a one-way, and it would have just disrupted way too much. So in the end, we decided to look at this green oval to your left, and those are currently executive parking spots. But talking with the executive team, they were okay with taking about 2 of them to add the charging stations. I think to the charging station, and so we were looking at adding that. However, we ran into some more logistical issues, and if you look at the far right of the slide, you'll see a blue star. That blue star is where the electrical panel was for the electrical panel was in the basement. So the first big issue was that panel was 200 amps, which was enough power to for that one charging station. However, 150 of those amps were being directed somewhere else, and that only left 50 to use for the charging station. And you need at least 60 amps for that to get the adequate power. So that was because of that, that was a big hindrance. And then on top of that, we would have had to go up to the first floor, come through the ceiling, out across the daycare, which is near the yellow oval, and then bore through 2 or 3 beams of concrete, and then come down and trench through the soil, and then cut through the sidewalk just to get to that green oval. That would have been almost over 100 feet of just adding conduit and wiring. And so because we were only adding that one charging station, that was not enough. The cost did not make any sense. However, we were trying to figure out a way to make it work due to those intangible benefits. So as mentioned before, we did have that equity goal, and because of that exposure. But in the end, that the overall cost ballooned to $8,000, which is well over that $3,000 max that we have for each charging station. And at this time, we have no electric vehicles or charging stations at this site. And those 2 Nissan Leafs that were put in the site were released and given to the Department of Public Works for their community and outreach programs that they do for recycling. And so this was one of our more difficult sites. And if you go on to the next slide, this is 651 14th Street. This is our Department of Watershed. This is a this was one of our better sites. This was a former mill, and it had ample power. If you look at the blue oval at the bottom, and then the blue circle kind of top middle, those were the power sources, and they had 800 amps of power, which was more than enough. And there was ample parking spaces where we could add charging stations. We were looking at adding 3 dual port charging stations. And that's where the green ovals were, as well as, and also due to the fact that this site also has 5 Chevy Volts. So if you look at the orange oval on the left, that's where they currently charge. They have the outlets installed there, and they use the charging cord that comes with the vehicle to charge there. So this was a perfect site. It was great. However, we did not install any charging stations due to the fact that the vehicles were not being driven. The driving miles were not going to meet the requirement that we have. That's 7,500 miles for Leafs and 10,500 miles for the Volts. So this led us to look at opportunities for right-sizing. So as we do look to expand our EV fleet, we do want to see where we can look for opportunities to right-size the vehicles to also make more of the case to add EV, so we can meet that yearly mileage requirement. But another part of this was there was that intangible benefit for this site as well. At the bottom of the picture, you'll see 14th Street. This is a very busy street for the city of Atlanta. It's in our northwest corridor, or northwest border of the city, and it would have been a good visibility package for this site so that we can showcase that we are being good stewards of taxpayers' dollars, reducing emissions, and also that to encourage that public adoption. And that is something that we always want to, that we do keep in mind here when we're adding these charging stations for city use. And this was our one of the better sites, but due to the lack of driving mileage that we need, this site has been put on hold. And if you go on to the next slide, this is 72 Marietta Street. This is our Department of Watershed and our Employee Psychological Services. So this site has 4 Chevy Volts and 1 Nissan Leaf. And they currently have 3 charging stations. And these are not dual ports, so these are just the single stations. Excuse me. The site had, we were originally looking at putting it at the back door. However, there is a van accessible handicap parking spot. And where we were adding the charging stations, the cord would have impeded wheelchair and foot traffic, as well as there were water pipes along the underneath that. And that was just been very costly. However, this is one of our more creative and adaptive sites due to Atlanta used to be a, I mean, it still is a very active, has a lot of active railroads. And if you look at the bottom of the, if you look at the bottom picture, you'll actually, there's still an active rail line right there. And so with the rail lines being there first, we added a, the bridges and roads were built above them. And what you see is the parking lot is below the roads. And so with that, the electrician was able to run the conduit underneath the viaduct, which was perfectly fine because it actually did not, the cost for cutting the concrete was no longer there, or no longer an issue. And so we were able to add a pedestal on one end of the parking lot, as well as the 2 stations at the top picture on the corner of the break room. And we're actually looking at adding more charging stations to this site as well. And this site did not have a security issue due to the fact that this parking lot is gated in and you need an access code. So the employees will come in, they have their own card, they scan it, they come in, and they can take the vehicle out with their own respective cards. And so that site was was one of our more creative issues. And so if you go on to the next slide, please. Some other considerations when installing charging stations. The ADA compliance was the biggest thing that we came across. So especially when it comes to van accessible. So when you do have a ADA parking spot, you'll have the the passenger side of the van should have a 8-foot width spot, which is the size of the parking space, or 5 feet for a wheelchair to exit a vehicle, and then a 3-foot turning radius that is connected to an ADA accessible ramp, as seen in the diagram on your right. And so when you are adding charging stations, as the city of Atlanta is currently adding more, you do want to keep in mind that you're not impeding that wheelchair or foot traffic, because you don't want to damage the cords or the connectors, and that's something else to keep in mind as well. As you're adding charging stations, another part of the outreach is charging station etiquette. So as making sure that if the cords are not on the ground, if you can wrap them up as much as possible. And then that there's also retractable cords, which is one way to kind of mitigate that. But we found that it's still all about education, so people know that you're taking care of the equipment as much as possible. So while adding those, and then with adding the, if you have to move any ADA spots, just keep in mind, you just want to be as attentive as possible to that process. And then the workplace charging challenge, Atlanta was 4th in that challenge, and we are still, we were a member of that, part of that. We are part of that. And when adding these charging stations, as previously mentioned, we do have some, our City Hall parking garage, where they have the city side, and then there's some that are for public use, especially as our employees are purchasing electric vehicles. It shows that we're being innovative. I'm going to stay in tune with new technologies, and especially as your fleet is converting to electric vehicles, you might be convincing some of your own employees to purchase their own electric vehicle, as we saw with our Ride and Drive last fall. And so just some summaries and takeaways, if you please go to the next slide. Effective communication between our departments was very crucial in implementing this program, and we maintained a relationship with our fleet services, finance, legal, as well as the respective departments that received these vehicles to do any training and education, as well as learning about the maintenance of these vehicles, because these vehicles are so very different. They are quiet, and people are not used to the way that they sound and how they operate, although they're not that different from a gasoline vehicle. That communication was key to develop and effectively implementing this program. And then one thing that we did learn, especially from our first case study, was new construction, municipal and commercial, should be EV ready. So we are in the process of developing some policies that will make a new construction EV ready with conduit, as well as trying to address EV parking, and when as these become more prevalent within our city limits, especially due to the fact that Georgia was #2 in EV sales in the last year. And with that, we have 25,000 electric vehicles in the state of Georgia, and 20,000 of those are in the metro Atlanta area. So we have potentially 20,000 electric vehicles funneling in and out of the city. And we want to make sure that we have a robust infrastructure that can support them. And then when selecting sites for your charging stations and electric vehicles, do keep in mind the current vehicles, electric and gasoline. So as mentioned, with our yearly mileage requirement for our leaf and for the volt. The electrical capacity, to make sure that you have an adequate amount of amps. That range is usually 60 amps to 225 amps for level 2 charging stations. And then the monthly miles driven by employees. As well as we also encourage you to contact the Electrification Coalition. They have been a very great resource for us, as well as we also have worked with Clean Cities as well. Our Clean Cities Georgia's, we're part of that coalition. But Electrification Coalition has been a very good partner, and we really encourage you to work with them, and also join the ESCC, because you also, for more information, and you'll get access to quite a few resources and what other cities are doing nationally. We also encourage you to join the Fleets for Future aggregated purchasing effort as a way to combat the high upfront costs associated with electric vehicles. And then with that, if you go to the next slide, our my contact information is on there, my number and my email. Also, please follow the Mayor's Office of Resilience on any social media to find out what we're doing, as well as Ryan's contact information and websites to the Energy Secure Cities and the Electrification Coalition, and an example of the program that Ryan mentioned earlier. And with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to what we've been doing here in Atlanta. We look forward to working with you all to kind of further push this, and we will also be able to send out that EVSC document that I mentioned before that this presentation is based off of afterwards. So with that, I'll go back with Ann so we can start asking questions.
Thank you, Justin. So as a reminder, on the right-hand side of your screen is a space for questions. So please type in your question there, and I'll be prepared to read those for Justin and Ryan. So if you have any questions, please type those into the panel to the right. All right, one question. Does the City of Atlanta provide any level 1 chargers for use by slower charging vehicles, plug-in hybrid electrics like the Chevy Volt? If not, why not?
Okay, I'm still there. Yes, the City of Atlanta does have
Justin, would you like to take that question?
Yes, sorry. Yes, the City of Atlanta does have level 1 charging stations. We have about 4 currently that are in the City Hall parking garage, and those are utilized by the Chevy Bolts.
We're going to check his mute feature real quick.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
Okay. Do I need to repeat that, or did you hear everything?
No, yeah, it sounded good. I think Ann might not have been able to hear you, so just continue on.
Okay, but that's pretty much it. We do have the 4 level 1 charging stations that are mainly utilized by the Chevy Bolts. We just found it a little more easier to for the level 2 charging stations, and I think that's more of an education piece to let our employees know that the difference between those 2 stations and how they operate when they are charging the respective leaf or the volt at each station.
All right, so we have our next question here. Given that most cars dwell long periods of time and L2 is overkill for them, why not deploy L1 with more than just an outlet?
Well, that's why I can take that question.
Okay.
Okay. That's due to the yearly mileage requirement that we have for the vehicles. So we want them to be utilized as much as possible, but we also want to make sure that they're being charged adequately enough to where they can still do the business of the for the city. And so by having the so we do have that mixture, but we mainly have level 2 because for one, that level 2 it helps with maintaining that mileage requirement. It also helps with that range anxiety that we are experiencing when employees are being exposed to this for the first time. So not discrediting level 1, but it just seems level 2 is just a better option for us for our respective requirements.
Okay, great. It looks like we have another question here. Do any installations work collaboratively, proactively with Georgia Power to optimize power delivery and charging to reduce electricity costs challenges? I don't know if Justin or Ryan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can answer part of that. So we do have a working relationship with Georgia Power, and so we work with that fleet replacement program that adds the charging stations. They have a subcontractor that is Atlanta-based, handles solar, that will do the electricity work, and then we do that in Georgia Power. But I can follow up with you to look more into that, reducing the electricity costs and grid challenges. But yeah, I can follow up with you offline on that part of that question.
All right, we have another one here. What percentage of the city's fleet chargers are publicly available? If a charger has publicly available, does that limit the city's fleet access? How do you balance these applications?
So I can address that one as well. As of now, there are not any slated. The 23 are not publicly open. They're the 10 that are specifically marked for city vehicles on the in our City Hall parking garage, and then there's another 4 that are used by the for city employees who have their own personal EV. And there's also a charge point station on the 4th floor of that parking garage that can be used for level 2 and then level 1 connection. And so as of right now, there are no public charging And that is something that we are trying to figure out is as these charging stations, if they're not, say, behind a closed gate, how are we going to address that issue? And that's more within the City Hall parking garage. And so what we're trying to do is see if we can add more workplace charging stations so those can be utilized, and then the ones that are for city vehicle use only will stay for city use. But it is something that we're still actively working, and we're at this time.
Okay, great. I have another question here. Would Atlanta consider adopting electric public buses in addition to passenger vehicles and government fleets?
I can adjust that one as well. So the thing with Atlanta is MARTA, which is our transit authority, is its own separate entity, although we do have a very great working relationship with them. They currently are more CNG than with their buses than anything. However, they are launching a pilot currently, as of now actually. They launched it, I think, a few weeks ago with an electric bus now. So one of the big hindrances that we've experienced was that electric buses have that high upfront cost, but that is just steadily going down. And so we're looking more, that's more of a MARTA, which is its own separate entity, but they are exploring that option as we look more to improve moving our municipal fleet, our sedan fleet, to electric vehicles.
Okay, great. And here's another question about the city. Has the city considered providing solar arrays or canopies as one option for reducing long-term electricity costs of the chargers?
Yes, it's actually something we are currently exploring right now. We were trying to see if there was a way to incorporate solar charging directly into, solar power directly into electric vehicle charging on the top deck of our parking garage. So due to the fact that parking garage faces south and there's nothing really blocking it, it would also give a good public image, since that the Interstate 20 and I-85 and 75 look right behind it. But we are currently looking at any opportunities for that, especially with Atlanta's solar portfolio, and we do work with our renewables and as a part of the energy team as well to see what opportunities there are for that.
All right, and that was our last question. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up here. And again, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. And thank you, Justin and Ryan and Ann, for hosting the webinar. The webinar has been recorded and will be available on the webinar archive page of cleanenergy.org. So if you guys get a chance to go over there and check it out. I also want to try and drive you guys to Electrification Coalition.org and AtlantaGA.gov to see what else everyone on the webinar today has going on. So if you did enjoy today's presentation, please consider joining SACE so that we continue to work towards clean energy solutions for the Southeast. So have a great week, everyone, and we appreciate you joining us today.